The lectionary serves up a luscious story this week. It's a story of the early church post Jesus' death and resurrection. And the story features Peter, and Peter's in trouble. He has offended the powers that be in this emerging church, and he has been called into the principal's office to account for himself. And as he arrives, they say, "So, you've been eating and hanging out with those people, have you?" And Peter, this is the 11th chapter of the book of Acts, says, "Well, as a matter of fact, I just had this amazing dream. I was in prayer, and in the prayer, a trance came over me, and this vision came upon me." And he tells them about this sheet coming down from heaven, and on this sheet there are clean animals and there are unclean animals, and he's told to take and eat. But Peter is a good Jew. He knows not to eat the unclean animals, and he says as much. The sheet goes back up, but then it comes down again, same thing, it comes down again, same thing, and every time Peter is clear, "I am a good Jew. I do not eat unclean animals." And then the voice that Peter finally recognizes as a sacred voice says, "How dare you? How dare you call unclean something that I have made, something precious in my sight?" At that point, Peter and the powers that be came to an agreement that the mission would now include both Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus. This is a pivotal point in the early church. It's often called the beginning of the Gentile mission. It's that place where all of a sudden this new Jesus-following community was no longer simply Jewish. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the beginning it was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. He had no intention of being anything but Jewish. Peter was Jewish. All of the followers were Jewish. They had no intention of being anything but Jewish. But at this point, the table has now expanded and included someone who is not Jewish. And the community has changed. This text is often used as a justification for evangelism, or what I like to call colonization, Christian colonization. It's that idea that Peter and his buddies, and for that matter, you and I, as people who believe Jesus, have something special and unique, and everybody else needs that same thing that we have. So we go forth and we make disciples, and we make people to look and act and sound like us, in the name of Jesus, of course. I'm going to ask us to back up. This whole Christian colonization, this Gentile mission, this conversion, is not only problematic, it is not only an abomination sociologically speaking, it is also unbiblical. It's not what this story is about. This story actually begins with the story of Cornelius in chapter 10 of Acts. And conveniently, the story of Cornelius is never in the lectionary. So if you are just a lectionary following church, you'll never get his story. But his story in the 10th book of Acts is that he is a Roman centurion. Now, what you need to know about the Roman centurion is that that was the soldiers. That was the armed guards. Those were the people who killed Jesus, right? The Roman centurions. Importantly, they were Roman citizens. They were not Jewish. And they were the ones that enforced the oppression for the state of Rome. They were the enemy. Cornelius was a Roman centurion. Now, it is rumored that he was a nice one. It is spoken in the story that he actually befriended many of the Jewish families that he was in charge of oppressing. He was the good cop. You know, you've heard the story of the good cop. Well, that would be Cornelius. But imagine, Cornelius is also the Israeli soldier on the Gaza Strip, right? Cornelius is also the Ferguson police officer in Ferguson. Cornelius might be a good guy, and apparently was a good guy, but this whole thing is inherently problematic. And worse, there is no indication in the story whatsoever that Cornelius ever became anything but a Roman centurion. When he came to share in the Jesus story, he was not asked or expected, nor did he choose to disavow his role as a Roman centurion. He didn't cease being a Roman citizen. He didn't stop wearing the uniform of the soldier. He didn't become Jewish. He remained Cornelius, a Roman centurion, and he broke bread together with Peter. So don't mistake this story for Kumbaya. I don't think it was. I think it was an important turning point in the early community, but it was terrifying, and the consequences were grave. Years ago, I had this story redefined for me by a colleague. She and her spouse, her female spouse, were new to the community of our church, and she used this text to explain how it was back in the day that a queer couple could be in the church, right? And how dare you say that I am unclean? The text was really important to her personally as she came to accept herself. And when she preached and used this text in our setting, it also became really helpful to our community to understand, right? How dare we judge one person or another to be clean or unclean? So, curiously, when many years later I found the courage to name my own truth and come out, leave my husband, begin to date, be the lesbian that I am, this colleague, who had been so helpful in helping me understand, could not abide. In fact, sent me this horrible letter. It was a long, single-spaced, just long letter about how terrible I was. 2 pages, single-spaced. And what she said in this long letter, she and her partner, was that I was guilty of adultery and that I wasn't acting like a Christian and I shouldn't be a minister because I was not officially, legally, completely divorced from my ex while I was dating. Right? So you are unclean, she said. It turns out that talking about this sheet and this diversity and eating with one another is easy. But actually doing it, actually being at one with someone who is very different from us is really problematic. And it affects us. It changes us, right? One of the jokes we used to make at church when we were open and affirming was that we don't care whether you are married to a man or a woman. We don't care like the gender of your spouse, but just come and bring us your children. That's what we want. And we would chuckle and laugh, and it was cute and it was funny. But what wasn't funny and what is important is that what we were saying is, as long as you look like us. So we don't care the gender of your spouse, but as long as you come with a spouse, right? And you bring us your children, right? So as long as you come onto our sheet and act like we act on our sheet, we're going to be cool. Well, we had a family come to us that was polyamorous. And it was fascinating to watch how, and myself included, really struggled with that. Like, we didn't care the gender of the partners, but wait a minute. Marriage is between one person and another person, right? And covenantal relationships, I said, matter. So there was a whole lot of judgment, and I don't know that any of it was really direct. It was mostly indirect, as these things are. And the family pretty quickly left the church. Who gets to decide how we're going to behave on the sheet? Right? Who gets to set the sheet rules? Are we going to behave on the sheet the way the first folks on the sheet chose to behave? Are we going to be circumcised and not eat cloven-footed animals, right? Are we going to behave as the original sheet sitters behaved? Or are we going to make new community norms with the new folks that arrive? Are we going to renegotiate our community norms? Or are we just going to say, you can do your thing and I can do my thing, and it's okay, we can be different? Curiously, importantly, it is this latter example that is at play in the story today. There is absolutely no indication that Peter stopped being anything but a good Jew, and that Cornelius remained a good Roman centurion. And they could be together, each doing their own thing. We often casually quote Gandhi's "Be the change you wish to see in the world." And it's a beautiful quote. But I think we forget that if we're going to be the change, the first person that's going to get changed is us. First to go are our assumptions and our bigotries and our judgments of other people. Peter's closing line really says it all. He says, God told me not to label any person common or unclean. Period. God told me not to label anybody common or unclean. And where this biblical truth is practiced, oh, what a wonderful world it would be.